first of all, this notion of the new normal, not an expression I'm crazy about, but nonetheless I think captures the idea that it's unclear what's changed. It's unclear when you look at buying patterns, for example, even in tickets. You see events that sell well are still selling well, but the pickup is a little bit late. What does that mean? You look at what's going on in media and the fragmentation of media, generally a good thing. You have more people circling around sport because it's a very compelling product, but how's that going to play out and how's that going to move forward? So I think just trying to understand what this new normal is across the sort of core pillars of ticketing, sponsorship, and media. This year, I think, is the first year in a few where there's enough stability, let's say, in the marketplace to start figuring those things out. I think from that flow a few other key issues. This whole issue of capitalization and resilience. Certainly resilience was a major topic during COVID by definition. You're seeing a lot more activity continuing with private equity and new forms of ownership. So I think this transition we're going through, and I don't know whether it's a transition or a reset of how sport is capitalized, I think is going to be critical. I think you'll continue to see an acceleration in this sort of broad context of the well-being of athletes. Mental health certainly has, I think, gained a lot of notoriety over the last few years appropriately, but there's still issues of physical health, all sorts of things that are associated with well-being. And then you start to stray into issues of, data and what does the athlete own and not own, and where does that data go, and how does it help athletes or potentially hurt athletes? We see a little bit of that in social media, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. So I think this notion of, what does protecting the well-being and nurturing the well-being of an athlete really mean? And then to me, I think, probably the biggest issue on the agenda, and again, this will not be solved next year, but the biggest issue on the agenda for sport, what's sport's role in society? I think, Australia is actually a good reflection of this. If you look back, say 30 years ago, sport was becoming professional, but it was dominantly a community activity. Sport was arguably more community than it was necessarily commerce. And I think not only Australia, but around the world, we've seen that swing pretty heavily now, where sport has become principally a commercial activity, and I think secondarily a social activity. And if you look at the challenges that we have as a society, I think sport has a very positive role to play in its old shoes. In its shoes as really a foundation and a pillar of the community. And so I think that sport, while you have these forces of capitalization that will push sport to become more and more aggressive commercially, I don't think that's antithetical to the notion of sport being a major force for cultural change. I spent a lot of time in media, and everybody classifies sport as sort of media and entertainment, and there's certainly some truth to that. But the fundamental difference between sport as entertainment and film, records, whatever you want to call it, other form of entertainment, those are all made up. They're great and they're terrific and they're fun, everybody enjoys it, but it's all a fiction. Sport is real. Sport is real people on a real pitch, and whether that's professional athletes, whether that's you and your mate, and there's an element to sport that makes it different from other entertainment, and I think we lose that if we become too commercial. I think maybe the long-term challenge, maybe the next decade challenge, if you will, for sport, is to recenter. Don't lose the commercial aspect. It's a commercial world. That's important to continue to drive that forward and accelerate that. But I think sport counts itself short if it doesn't pull back and bring that community aspect to what it does in all regards. If sport truly wants to create its own space, and I have a particular lens on this as a sort of technology person and entrepreneur, but I would put two wrappers around sport. First is just this notion that sport is already playing a bigger role socially than most other commercial activities. We see that in what's going on in, whether it's diversity or awareness or women in sport. Sport plays a leading role because of its prominence. And so I think sport will be in a successful place if we look forward in 2030. And we really feel good about the fact that, yes, these sporting franchises and leagues and so forth are a thriving commercial enterprise that's doing well for its athletes and rewarding them and so forth, but at the same time is back to what it was as a fundamental rock of the community. And I think that, to me, that has to be part of that 2030 vision. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that sport can be a great place for innovation in all sorts of things. And whether that's innovation in social context, whether that's innovation in commercial. And I think that Australia, for example, has a huge opportunity in front of it in terms of leading the world in all of these categories. And that's simply because if you talk to people what Australia is, you'll get lots of different answers, but one common answer to all of it, Australia always has been and continues to be a sporting nation. And so I think it has the opportunity, whether it's in technology, society, politics, whatever it may be, to really leverage its sporting tradition and really amplify that tradition to create an environment where we really can look at a country that really represents this idea of community and commerce coming together to create something that's a fundamental tentpole of society. That would be my vision for sport more broadly. I think it's a very attainable vision for Australia over the next 10 years. Everyone believes Australia is a sporting nation. All right? There's no one I know of. My favorite story about this is that, in shops I'll often hear two women talking deeply about sport and hammy injuries and all sorts of things. And while this occasionally happens in other countries, I can tell you Australia is unique in the level of commitment and care for sport. So I think Australia starts in a great place where both internally and externally it's a credible place. And then I think you also have to apply a dose of reality to it, which is, Australia, for all it has, is a small place, at least in terms of population. Coming from Canada, Canada's a small population, but we have this massive country sort of right next door called the US. And so it creates an immediate avenue for entrepreneurism and idea sharing and so forth. Australia, has beauty in its isolation, but also has challenges, I think, in its isolation. And so I think the challenge for Australia is to take that sense of a sporting nation in all the things that it means, sports medicine, sports technology, sports performance, all the things that it can mean in terms of leadership and innovation. And it needs to find a way to connect that to the rest of the world, to find a way to attract people to Australia, to help build companies and build ideas, and then similarly find ways to connect back up again. The work, for example, that the Vic government does on a very regular basis to connect to the outside world is extremely critical, because you can innovate in Australia, you can do really imaginative things in Australia, but you can't scale in Australia. And that requires connections to the outside world. And so I think it's this combination of really nurturing Australia into and of itself and bringing talent into Australia, stopping talent from leaving Australia, but at the same time really making sure Australia is very connected to both Asia, Europe, and North America, so that as opportunities build, as innovations happen, they can find themselves to a scale market, and then things can continue to go from there. Sports fans want fundamentally two things. They want to be engaged, right? They want to feel as if there's a reason for them to lean in. And then obviously sports fans always want their team to win. People I think don't understand how important winning is in sport. Participating is really important, but I think winning gives a lot of satisfaction. And since not everybody can win on the pitch, there's lots of other ways to win, and lots of other ways to really, as I said, sort of connect with society and be part of a culture, I think, that drives forward both an individual and a country. And I think for the sport fan, if you sort of look down the list, right? There's never been a broader media landscape. I can watch any sport I want just about any time, anywhere. Now, I can't always discover that easily, and I think that's a challenge for sport, to put sport in front of people that they've never seen before and really engage in that. But certainly from a distribution standpoint, there's never been a better time to be a fan in terms of at least sitting on the couch and watching sport. I think the same is true from a participation standpoint, and whether you're talking about running a Zwift bike in your house, or whether you're talking about going out and playing on the pitch. I think we've seen a resurgence of that a little bit after COVID. I think that needs to be nurtured and driven forward. So facilities and technology and wearing your life on your wrist, those sorts of things are all positives, I think, as a sports fan. I think, but last but not least, I think it's important again that sport means more than just the play on the pitch. And I think that's the case today, in large, with the sort of social context of sport. But I think sport needs to look at fans as not just fans, but as members of their community, to continue to nurture that. So I think it's a great time to be a fan, but I think it's also a great time for fans to ask for more and keep asking for more. I think what stands in the way is you need to recognize that it's more than events and bravado, that are going to build a sustainable economy around sport, particularly in such a relatively small, from a population perspective, and relatively isolated country like Australia. The challenge is for people like state governments and federal governments to understand that while they don't have to do everything, there are some things that they can do to really help innovate. For example, in the technology sector, one of the things you care about the most in technology is having data to experiment with and to understand. And so governments can do things like create repositories of data that they ensure are controlled and managed. But if you want to be an entrepreneur building things on top of those, you have to be in Australia to be able to use that data. Small little things like this that really can attract talent, because to create sustainability, you always have to go back to the people. In any enterprise, one rule is very true. You get the right people and you can do just about anything. Even if you don't have the money, even if you don't have the time, you get the right people, anything can be accomplished. Australia has to be in the business of ensuring that it's always attracting and retaining the best people. Focus on that and everything else will fall into line. Miss that and it doesn't matter how much time or money you have, you're not going to be able to create the outcomes you want. So to me, at the end of the day, focus on people, focus on getting the right people, retaining the right people, and the rest will pretty much take care of itself.